Giovanni Palmieri had never liked the silence in Bobby Spencer's house. It carried too many echoes, old arguments, unfinished confessions, memories of people who never got the chance to say goodbye. But that afternoon, as sunlight flattened itself across the kitchen table and a half-eaten sandwich sat forgotten in front of him, Gio turned that silence into something else entirely, a staging ground. Emma Scorpio Drake leaned forward opposite him, elbows on the table, her expression a mixture of determination and nerves. The plan between them had sounded reckless in theory, dangerous when whispered across phone lines and stairwells, but here, with the walls close and the world temporarily shut out, it became inevitable. There was too much at stake to back down now. The lab represented answers about what had been done, who had ordered it, who in Port Charles had decided that truth was negotiable so long as power remained intact. Emma's voice had trembled when she first suggested they get proof. Gio's had steadied it when he said they wouldn't just talk about justice, they would go after it. So he reminded her of that now. He didn't sugarcoat the risk, didn't pretend they were fearless. Instead, he acknowledged the danger and framed it as something they were no longer willing to run from. Emma was not a child chasing a thrill, she was the product of two legacies built on confronting the darkness. Gio, despite his easy grin and laid-back charm, carried his own line of loyalty and unfinished debts. Together, they decided the lock on that lab door was less terrifying than another day of pretending they hadn't seen what they'd seen. The conversation was cut short when footsteps approached and Nedd Ashton, still Nedd, to the few who remembered the softer edges beneath his armor, stepped into the room. Gio straightened quickly, the conspiratorial edge vanishing from his expression, replaced by a polite respect that felt entirely real. He had grown up hearing about the Quartermaines as if they were a dynasty in a tragic epic, always two missteps away from burning down their own kingdom. To have Nedd in front of him, carrying that same mix of command and exhaustion, made that mythology feel uncomfortably human. Nedd greeted him, voice warm, but there was a tightness around his eyes that betrayed the strain he refused to name. The older man's banter was familiar, paternal even, as he asked about Gio's music, his future, the vague promise of stability that adults always seem to project onto younger people. Yet every few sentences, Nedd's hand would drift toward his chest or the edge of the counter for balance. His breath caught once, twice, subtle enough that a stranger might have missed it. Gio did not. He hesitated, concern rising, but Nedd brushed it all aside with that stoic, almost stubborn composure that defined him. The Quartermaines did not show weakness, not if they could help it. Especially not in front of the next generation. When Nedd stepped back outside, the thin line he'd been walking finally snapped. Alone with his phone and logistics that should have been simple, he learned the movers had sent Lulu Spencer's boxes, the remnants of another broken chapter, another life uprooted, to the wrong address. They were supposed to go to the Quartermaine estate, where history, grief, and obligation stacked themselves neatly in curated rooms. Instead, they had been delivered to a house that was no rightful substitute, Drew Kane's. It sounded, on paper, like a minor inconvenience. To Nedd, it was an insult layered on top of an ongoing fear that their legacy was slipping through his fingers while everyone else treated the family's foundation like an open secret up for revision. Lulu's belongings were not just furniture and keepsakes. They were symbolic of promises the family had made, to honor, to protect, to remember. The idea of those boxes being dropped into someone else's orbit without his approval struck at something deeper than frustration. Standing in the driveway, phone pressed so hard to his ear his knuckles blanched, he let the anger spill over. His voice sharpened, every syllable edged with the desperation of a man watching the control he had left seep away in petty oversights and slow betrayals. Drew arrived at that exact emotional breaking point, armed not with malice, but with his own sense of justification. He framed it as reassurance. Nothing was lost, nothing stolen, just temporarily relocated. The heirlooms and boxes, he explained, were at his place, safe, waiting. But the phrasing, "at my house," landed with a weight Drew didn't fully feel and Nedd couldn't swallow. To Nedd, it sounded like encroachment. Like someone who had already threaded himself into Quartermain property battles now laying hands on the intangible weight of their past. Drew saw himself as a man stepping up, a man who had invested, sacrificed, redefined his place in town and family. Nedd saw a man who had tried to buy the mansion, now playing custodian of pieces that were never his to claim in the first place. The misunderstanding metastasized between them in seconds. Nedd's temper, already lit, surged. He lashed out, accusing, warning, his voice raw with the unspoken truth that he feared being replaced not just in business, but in blood. His body was signaling that he was past his limits, but his pride refused to loosen its grip. The argument spilled into that dangerous zone where nothing said is about the surface issue anymore. Drew, feeling attacked, defaulted to skepticism. Nedd had stumbled, clutched his chest, fought for breath, but Drew had seen too much manipulation and too many staged collapses in his life to blindly accept what his instincts should have recognized as real. He read it as theater, a way for Nedd to win the upper hand, to shut down the confrontation by redirecting it to concern. Offended by what he believed was emotional blackmail with a family crest stamped on it, Drew's patience snapped. He threw back dismissive words, accusing Nedd of overdramatizing, of clinging to dominance through performance. The decision to walk away came not from cruelty, but from a warped sense of boundary. In Drew's mind, refusing to enable what he thought was manipulation was strength. In reality, it was the fatal misjudgment of a man who had forgotten that even proud legends can physically break. The moment Drew turned his back, the scene changed. The anger that had been propping Nedd upright drained, and the pain he had pushed aside demanded its due. The world around him seemed to narrow, the driveway, the cool air, the distant quiet of the street. His hand moved to his chest again, this time not as a gesture of annoyance, but raw instinct. There was no one there now to interpret the alarm in his eyes, no one to challenge him back into the house, no one to force him to sit, breathe, call for help. His knees buckled. That polished, defiant posture that had withstood decades of scandals, battles, and boardroom betrayals finally gave way. He collapsed, not as a titan, not as a CEO, not as the last line of defense for an unruly empire, but simply as a man whose body had been begging him to stop pretending it was unbreakable. Inside Bobby's house, Gio and Emma had no idea what was unfolding just beyond their bubble of righteous intent. They were still tracing the edges of their plan, arguing timings and access codes, trying to reconcile their belief in the people they loved with their suspicion that someone connected to that lab had crossed a line that could not be ignored. The parallel was devastating without their knowing it. Young determination ready to expose corruption, and outside, a man who had spent his life wrestling with the fallout of other people's compromises now lying helpless and unseen. The same town that demanded heroes in crisis allowed its most stubborn protector to fall between the cracks in a moment when he needed grace more than judgment. For Drew, the fallout would not be measured simply in whether the heirlooms survived intact or the boxes eventually landed in the mansion's foyer. His choice, to interpret Nedd's distress as manipulation instead of warning, would carve a wound that logic couldn't heal. Port Charles had always blurred the lines between real threat and calculated performance. It had trained its residents to question everything, to suspect everyone. But this time, that reflex had gone too far. Something genuine had been crying out beneath the bluster, and he had refused to see it. The man who prided himself on protecting others had walked away from someone who needed protection in the most basic, human sense. When Nedd is finally found, crumpled where pride and neglect left him, the clock will already be against him. That race to pull him back from the edge won't just be medical, it will be moral. Every person pulled into the crisis will have to confront the question of how often they've dismissed his warnings, underestimated his limits, or assumed he could take one more hit because he always had before. The Quartermain family, never strangers to guilt, will once again stand under unforgiving light. Those heirlooms, those boxes from Lulu's dismantled home, the objects everyone fought over as symbols of legacy, will seem unbearably trivial compared to the single fragile truth that almost slipped away on the pavement: Nedd's life. And threaded through all of it, Emma and Gio's dangerous mission, Drew's miscalculation, Nedd's collapse, is the same relentless theme that defines Port Charles. People forget that behind the schemes and strategies, there are bodies that break, hearts that misjudge, and lines that once crossed cannot be undone. The lab break-in will move forward, the secrets buried there will demand attention, but this moment, this failure to see a man's pain for what it was, will haunt them. Because in a town where everyone is trained to doubt, sometimes the most catastrophic mistake is refusing to believe the one crisis that isn't a lie.